Welcome back to our live briefing. Currently, we are dealing with constitutional amendments, so I'll be briefing you through the 8 amendments that have already taken place now and voting has taken place on them. The first amendment related to the party's values and proposed inserting the values of stewardship and sustainability into the constitution alongside freedom, fairness, opportunity, and diversity. That amendment was not supported by the Constitutional Review Committee because values are fundamental issues that should not be changed or altered without a significant consideration, consultation, and debate. Therefore, this proposed resolution would be better suited to a policy debate. Congress delegates agreed with that recommendation from the Constitutional Review team and that the amendment failed to pass. The second amendment related also to the party's principles, and it proposed substituting the word ruling with governing to the party in power. This was supported by the Constitutional Review Committee because we live in a democracy where the party in power governs rather than rules. This amendment, however, failed to pass because it did not, because it is an amendment to Chapter 1, which requires that the threshold for passing that is 80% of registered delegates. The third amendment related to the party's principles. This one proposed inserting the phrase quality education into our constitution as something that must be progressively realized alongside housing, health, and social security. This was not supported by the Constitutional Review Committee, as the Constitutional Court has upheld access to basic education is already an immediately recognizable right and not a progressively realizable right. A different section of the Constitution, furthermore, also promotes access to education. This amendment also failed to meet the 80% requirement of all registered delegates and therefore did not pass. The fourth amendment related to the party's principles, and it proposed inserting a clause that stipulates, and I quote, "A corrupt-free, transparent, and accountable government is one such principle." This was supported by the Constitutional Review Committee because it is fundamental to the DA's vision for our country. This amendment, however, failed to meet the 80% required threshold of registered delegates and therefore did not pass. The fifth amendment proposed inserting a clause relating to the party's program of action, requiring that the DA use all available instruments of political power to ensure that South Africa's transition to a zero-carbon economy by around 2035, and it meets its emissions obligations to limit global warming, and that the party adopt an approach that ensures the highest level of environmentally sustainable practice is invoked, including limiting single-use plastics, deploying widespread urban greening, and protecting biodiversity. This proposal was not supported by the Constitutional Review Committee, and it was on the basis that it is incredibly specific and detailed and thus not constructed to be a constitutional amendment, and that this would be better suited for a policy framework. The Constitutional Review Committee instead supported an alternative formulation which was proposed that detailed and relates to the party's principles rather than that program of action. 85.6% of registered delegates voted in support of the alternative formulation of the amendment, and therefore delegates had to vote on whether to pass this alternative formulation of the amendment. That amendment was subsequently not passed due to the fact that only 55.27% of registered delegates voted in favor of this amendment. So we'll now turn to the votes on amendments which do not affect Chapter 1 of our Constitution and thus only require only 2/3 of the delegates that are present to vote. It is only those amendments that relate to Chapter 1 of the party's Constitution that require 80% of registered delegates. So the sixth amendment, which related to early or distance voting rules and proposed amendment to the Constitution to oblige the Federal Council to prescribe type procedures for aforementioned voting rules for any meeting where voting is to take place and where early distance and voting has been approved by the Federal Executive. This amendment was supported by the Constitutional Review Committee because it seeks to acknowledge part of the reality that we live in, which is a post-COVID world where meetings are going to be virtual, and because the placing of an obligation on Federal Council is to ensure that there are no gaps whatsoever at any given time. The seventh amendment related to the voting system for election positions and proposed changing the phrase, and I quote, proportional voting system to voting system, wherever the election of more than 2 people to 1 office within the party are involved, and the voting system must be approved by the Federal Council. This was supported by the Constitutional Review Committee because what it does is to allow Federal Council more flexibility in determining the type of voting system to be used in internal party election procedures instead of limiting that system to a proportional one. The 8th amendment related to the standards of conduct of party members. This was proposing that members would be guilty of misconduct not only when they publicly oppose the party's principles or repeatedly oppose party policies, except or through appropriate party structures, but also when they repeatedly undermine the party's principles and policies. This amendment was proposed to broaden the scope of the party's principles to include the party's values as well. This was not supported by the Constitutional Review Committee on the basis that the inclusion of the phrase actively undermines is very vague and subjective, and thus may lead to spurious complaints. Amendment 6, 7, and 8 all passed with more than 80% of the delegates who were present, and it meant that they were all successfully passed. So colleagues, I want to draw the distinction so that there is no confusion again. The 80% threshold for passing of amendments relates to those amendments relating to Chapter 1 of the Constitution, because it is about the party's values, and you need a far more profound percentage for those changes to effect change. The rest of the amendments only require that 2/3 majority of the delegates who are present at any given time. So I'll be taking your questions if you have any. As we did with the previous live broadcasts, we'll be going through that chat forum, and those of you who have questions will take them up there. We're just giving you enough time to make sure that you've got a fair chance to ask questions. And if there are no questions, then we'll meet again at the next live broadcast. Cool. Seems like we have one.
A question from ENCA.
Yeah.
I may have missed it. Did you specify what amendments 6, 7, and 8 were?
Yes, we did specify them. I can repeat them, but they are also available in, the information packs that were sent and also on the party's website. So just to refresh your memory, Amendment 6 related to early and distance voting, while Amendment 7 was relating to the voting system for internal elections, proposing that we substitute the phrase proportional voting system to voting system. Amendment 8 related to the standard of conduct for members of the party.
There's a question from Rebecca from the Daily Maverick.
Yeah.
Was the failure of the first 5 amendments to meet the minimum support threshold a concern? Does that suggest people are struggling with the voting system?
Absolutely not. It's not about the voting system. I think what it speaks to is the party membership's strong faith and belief in the party's principles and values, because for that you need a much higher threshold. So if the majority of Congress delegates believed that they should remain as they are, it's a vote of confidence in the current framing of those principles and values. Is that all? Cool. Thanks, colleagues. If any of you have follow-ups, you know the procedure, you can do it in there, and then we'll take it up from there. Thank you very much.